So you can go ahead and hit present. Thank you, Miles. So next slide. So just so we have a lot to talk about, but here's just a quick agenda for today. We will go over a little bit again what's NDIA, but I won't spend a lot of time on that because you're probably going to see that everywhere as we move through this process. But I really want to dive in on what is coalition, what's the difference between coalitions and partnerships, and what we have learned thus far on from coalitions around the country, how they function, how they came together, how they structure themselves, and what type of work they do. And I also want to just, since the infrastructure bill passed and there is some work there that, creating partnerships and coalition can really help your community take full advantage of the resources that coming through the federal funding. So we'll touch on that a little bit. And then also I want to just highlight some of not hot topics, things to consider. If you have a coalition, if you want to help create a coalition in your community, those are going to be important things to have in the back of your mind. Next slide. As you know, we're NDIA, National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and we became a former organization 15 years ago. And I'm sorry, 15 years into 2015 to help get the practitioners and people on the ground to have a unified voice, a unified force to advocate and really advocate and share knowledge throughout the country. So it's essentially NDIA itself. If you think about, we are an alliance, we're a coalition, and we have a different structure. But NDIA has been growing tremendously. So with over 500 affiliates, and we are spread out, and over 46 states. Sorry, next slide. So we have 4 main buckets, how we divide the work we do. One is providing support for people on the ground, advocating and really pushing for policy that supports our programming and advancing digital equity. We work with you guys again to raise awareness and do a lot of data and research. So all of those areas is going to be on our net inclusion in February. So I highly recommend you guys to go on our website and register for net inclusion so you can learn more about what other communities are doing for digital inclusion and learn and copy some of the models that's out there. So one of our roles in the community, really in the country, is really to come up with definitions. So make sure that we're all speaking the same language. So again, digital inclusion for us is really the process, is the work that we do. It's digital inclusion. Digital equity is the goal. So coalitions and partnership is a digital inclusion, a strategy to achieve digital equity in our community. Next slide. So for the last 6 months, pretty much, we've been reviewing what the role of coalitions and partnerships are in the country. And one of the main things coming out of that right now is a new coalitions guidebook that we're updating, and that you guys should see that coming out in December. So we're really excited that we're going, updating that guidebook is providing more context and more lessons learned. But as well, we updated our coalition definition. So one of the things that changed is really realizing that coalition is a collective of organizations that really work in the community to advocate towards digital equity. And it's really one of the major roles they play is really fostering the growth of the community's ecosystem, digital inclusion ecosystem. And, the coalition will do that by formalized structure and really facilitate collaboration and coordination among the community. Next slide. So right now I'm going to go, hopefully I have a lot of graphs and diagrams to talk about coalitions, because it's a not one size fit all. So I really want to dive, go this journey with me and think about how coalitions, what they are and how they function, and and start thinking, if you have a coalition, how that reflected, your experience with your coalition, but also if you were to be a support and get a coalition started in your community, what structure do you want your coalition to have? Next slide. So what are digital inclusion coalitions? So again, they are formed to address the need for coordination, collaboration. Now there's a lot more attention on the digital divide and the need for digital inclusion services, and to really maximize the impact, coalitions partners came together and realized that they need a better coordination system in their community. So make sure that we are now all providing the same type of services to the community, and we're leveraging each other's resources. It's organization. What's critical about what coalitions are is that it's a diverse group of organizations and members of the community that come together. So we, in NDIA, we have a working group for coalitions right now, and we talked about what are coalitions and what's the difference between a digital inclusion coalition or a coalition for just broadband or literacy. And there is a consensus that digital inclusion coalition cares, or at least having the mission that they want to achieve digital equity. And we know that to achieve digital equity, the digital inclusion services, it's not just about connecting people to broadband, but also make sure they have the skills and make sure that they have access to devices. So thinking that the diverse group of organizations usually that come together for a coalition are organizations that serve the community by providing the different parts of digital inclusion work. You might have organizations that's focused, can you go back? That's focused on training, and then you have another organization that's focused on providing refurbished computer or connecting people to low cost offer. So coalitions operate in the public realm, and they have a degree of transparency. So it's really a collective organization, and work with the community. So making sure that the community have access to anything that the coalition is producing. It's a critical part of coalitions, as well as they need to have a function, right? Coalitions are organizations, and they need to have a structure and a way for inclusive participation and decision making. Next slide. So talking to over 30 coalitions now, we are learning that coalitions they do different things based on the need of the community. So the coalitions they create, number one is create the partnerships. So coalitions within the coalitions, create the environment that a lot of different organizations are coming together, sometimes for the first time, and they're thinking and building strategies to solve digital inclusion. So that's one of the main things coalitions do. The other one is really provide public education and advocacy for not only for lawmakers, but also for other organizations that just to name, right? So my organizations do already digital inclusion work, but they don't call it digital inclusion. So coalitions play a big role in creating that consensus and shared language. Other coalitions are really focused on resources and professional development, making sure that their organizations and their community know how to use different resources in terms of digital literacy, what's some of the learning outcomes, but also know when there's a grant opportunity, and or have provide trainees for trainers, how they can better serve the population that they're targeting. And then you see the other roles that coalition play. And then the strategic program alignment, if one organization is providing the digital literacy, or the city or the community is going to light up our whole neighborhood, making sure that, like, hey, if you're going to do that work, the coalition wants to come together and make sure that there's also training that's being focused in that community, that is being offered. And then they were doing a drive for computer access, so for free computers, or so coalition really provide that environment, and they are focused on really providing program alignment and making sure that it's community focused, and all the services of digital inclusion can potentially be provided at the same time. One big one, that's those two, the number 5 and 6 are some of the newer areas that coalitions are playing a role lately. One is that creating their assessment and of needs and resources, and not only putting out a survey and gathering the data, but also sharing to the community, like putting on creating that space where people can go say, hey, somebody in my organization needs access to a computer. Where do they go? Or they need help with technical support. Coalitions are playing a big role now in getting that information, gathering the information, and have it ready for whenever the partner organizations or anybody in the community need those resources. And the digital equity plan. There's a big movement about making sure that if every community has a plan to achieve digital equity, and coalitions are an integral part of that. We'll talk more on that as we go. And number 7 is really innovate. Coalitions is really the place that community come together to think differently. My friend Jordana Barton from the Federal Reserve say that the digital divide, it's the problem is it's innovation. It's like we haven't innovated enough on ways to reach out low-income population and make sure they are connected and have the skills. And digital inclusion coalitions and partnerships around that are really an opportunity to innovate and making sure that these steps we're thinking a little bit differently. We're daring to think differently and how to reach and provide the best service to the community. Next slide. So this is a simple diagram to share how coalitions are structured and how work is done and what are the different roles community play. So if we start from the outer circle, if that represents the community, right? It's when starting a coalition, you defining the scope and the region that your coalition is going to operate within, it's critical. So really provide the landscape that's going to determine everything else for your coalition. And then the inner circle then represents the coalition and creating this coalition to build partnerships. And inside that circle, you see a couple of different colorful bubbles, because I was tapping into my inner 4th grader when I was doing this. Those bubbles represent the different aspects of coalition. So one is, the yellow. I guess actually I'm going to start with the blue bubble, start from the top. So the backbone. It's important to notice that now it's much more clear to us is that most coalitions that are formed and are able to sustain themselves and are able to have a bigger impact in the community have the support of a backbone organization. And that can be one organization, it can be many organizations. And for example, you guys, as serving in the libraries was always known to be the anchor institution that always did digital inclusion and really are in the forefront of that work. Most, if not all, the coalitions that I know have a library as part of their backbone, and I would say even more important, the libraries and in their community were really they were part of initiating building this coalition and getting people to the table to create a coalition and to figure out how to better serve the community. So the backbone organizations really provide, empower the coalition and provide skills and resources. And those can be just by the power of convening, as well as being a fiscal agent. And if the coalition are to receive funding to keep going, but also providing, allocating some of their staff time to do the administrative work of the coalition, sending emails or putting the survey together, or publishing some of the results of the assessment. So backbone organizations is a critical infrastructure of building coalitions, and libraries are a very big part of it. And I think one of the things to keep in mind, if you are a librarian and you want to gather the different organizations to advance in the work in digital inclusion in your community, it's make sure you don't do it alone, right? And making sure that the library can be a backbone, but the whole process it's sometimes a slow process, but it's building trust and inviting others to the table to play a leadership role. So you see on the dots there for the backbone is that it's important to note that there are different types of backbone organization, or it can be one organization again, but they can be, a particular organization can be part of the coalition or can just be outside. So that's why the one circle is outside of the coalition bubble, is because you can still be a backbone organization, not necessarily be entrenched in the work and the leadership and as an organization. So you can just provide the resources and the skills for the coalitions. So on the red dot, you see it's leadership. So usually coalitions have a steering committee or a smaller group of organizations that are responsible to think through what does the community need, and how we're going to get input from the community. When should we have the meetings, and let's set up the agenda. Let's figure out when it's time to do work as a collective, as in partnership, and how we make sure we're being intentional about inclusion and racial equity within the coalition. So every coalition has a leadership group, and again, it usually tends to be a group. And some of the coalitions in the beginning, it's interesting to that in the beginning, it starts with the partnership, which is the first step of a coalition, is create a partnership. And then as the partnership decide to create a coalition, they make sure that they end up and naturally they end up being this leadership group that is guiding the coalition to a certain point until we can establish a better structure or a guiding document or a charter, whatever it needs to be. And then how the coalition work, it's a very interesting, because sometimes people tend to think that coalitions does the work by the leadership, right? So the steering committee, the group of 5 organizations come together and they make some decisions and they actually do the work and implement. But what we found is that coalitions actually provide services to their community through a different set of a group. So those are the yellow dots that you see there. It's around, so the work is produced by project or by areas that the coalition wants to focus. So many coalitions have put task force together to provide, to work on how we're going to, better coordinate around digital literacy resources in the community. So, and that at that moment, the coalition created this task force or a working group that focuses specifically on that one task. So an example there is the digital equity plan. Coalition can be part or support or initiate a digital equity plan, but it's not the leadership group, the steering committee essentially, that is going to be working on that alone. It creates a task force and invites other members of the community to be part of that work and producing something. So this is important because for a couple of reasons. Again, here you see that the task force and the group within the coalition structure, they're mainly part of the coalition. So they work with organizations that say, hey, I want to be part of my community inclusion coalition. And then sometimes you have to bring in, depending on the task force area that you guys are working on, you bring in members of the community that are not necessarily part of the coalition, but they have a particular skills or resources that's going to help you deliver that services. So in the past, what I have seen is coalitions creating task force to put in a digital equity summit for their community. Like, where are we? Can we present, let's present both our findings on our survey and the data that we found on the digital divide that represents the digital divide for our community, and put in a task force for creating the equity plan, a task force to sign a letter to send to elected officials, or to let's figure out how to build a mesh network. So I have seen coalitions, again, providing that space and creating the structure, and from a task force or working group that allow other organizations to jump in and try to innovate and figure out how to best serve that community needs. Next slide. Here, it's just a different view, essentially, of what you saw, the diagram and the circles and the structure. And this is different view, I think, is important, so you can see how the different groups within the coalition structure is layered. Again, if you know, the bigger part is the most important, is the foundation, is the community. The community provide the foundation of how the coalition will be built, but also how it will progress over time. And then you see the backbone is the support, and it's just, you know, one layer of the coalition. I guess a very thin layer. It's almost like a blanket layer of support for the coalition to build up. So then you see the one layer up, you see is the coalition members. It's you can have membership and invite anybody, and making sure that people, that you be intentional about who you invite and how to start a coalition. And so that's really your knowledge powerhouse, that those organizations that are providing digital literacy and are connecting people and are serving the community, they know what is going on, and in bringing those organizations, those people together, is critical to know what's going on in their community. So most coalitions would have, for the coalition members, they would have a monthly meeting, and they bring all their organizations together to talk about, one, to share their resources and to share what they're working on, and just by doing that, making sure that knowledge is not just siloed in their community, and people are connecting and know what each other is doing. It really has become, you know, critical and determining what coalitions will focus on, and what areas need more help and need better alignment. So remember that making the coalition easy for organizations and everybody to participate is critical, but that's at the general membership level, is almost when people say, and then that's your knowledge powerhouse. And then once you decide what work their coalition wants to do, even if around education, advocacy, or funding, or sharing resource, or professional development, whatever area you want to your coalition to play a bigger role, or gathering data and sharing, most coalitions, they develop this working group, which is where the work gets done. So it's important to notice that the work doesn't get done at the general membership level, because it's almost like there's everybody is there, everybody wants to be part. So everybody is the owner of the process, which means it's very hard to coordinate and get things done. So it's helpful to create this task force and allow a smaller group to have this focused time to develop a strategy in a collective impact manner, right? And then it's important here that we have learned that the work that coalitions do in creating the working group or a task force around that, it's more successful if it's determined, if the group is built and it has a limited time to deliver something. Other coalitions have created, for example, a structure that instead of saying, hey, we want to work together to build a digital equity plan and have a start date and an end date, that seems to work a little bit better for a task force, a working group format, rather than having this some so-called working group or subcommittees that focus on training. And every meeting, this smaller working group was always talking about training and what's the resources and what are some of the who is doing what and what are the curriculum, what are the outcomes. Eventually, there is like a fatigue, and because it's never going to end, right? So if it's really important that if you do a coalition, it's helpful actually that you have, it's like a project. It's a project based. We're going to get together to do this, and we're going to produce this, and it's going to end at this date. And that really, it's the most consistent way across the country how coalitions actually provide work and do work. And then the top there is the smallest group usually tends to be the steering group, the leadership, the strategic leadership portion. So again, it's an organization, and coalition needs to have somebody and a group of people that are looking out, have the bird's eye view and see how things are connected, put it together. So the next slide. So the other slides are not so heavy, and I know I'm talking a lot. I wanted just to share all the different nuances and different layers of coalition, but just please put your questions on the chat, and then at the end we're going to have plenty of time to go through some of the questions, have more of a conversation, as well as later we'll share. We're going to have a separate time that we can have a smaller group discussion and a different day as well, so we can go a little bit deeper on all those different concepts. Here, I just really just a reminder that coalitions, even if it's through a task force or through the leadership group, coalitions are intentional about diversity and inclusion and racial equity. And who do you invite to a coalition? Most coalitions have a combination of those organizations serving in the different capacities. So community members, and if people they're not affiliated with the organization and they want to be part of a coalition, if you're building a coalition, you're part of a coalition, you can decide if that's something you want to allow or not. So again, it's coalitions in communities decide what they want to pick and choose from. But usually most coalitions have the support or have somebody from a government organizations, city or county, or even just different departments within the city, somebody from economic development, the library. But I think this part is important to say that like you don't have just a coalition of city department and organizations. So making sure that you have all these other organizations that tend to be the majority of members of the coalition. Nationally, it's really the public and nonprofit organizations, health organizations, housing institutions, education institutions, for-profit, and even businesses and foundations and other philanthropic organizations as well, and mainly I would say the digital inclusion providers. So in digital inclusion service providers here, again, most of them tend to be nonprofit, or government agencies like the library. But it's being intentional about, who's part of the coalition and who you invite to be at the table, are also people that, are also organizations that are providing services. This setup here sometimes is helpful to break down the different organization sectors that you want to invite, because and thinking about how your organization, how your community, is structured or what you have there. A lot of coalitions are actually, when it comes to building the leadership group or the steering committee, after a while they start holding elections and they put seat allocation. So we want 3 organizations that are providing digital inclusion, services. So the service providers, and we want to make sure that leadership also have maybe a spot for one person that is serving a local government, and one person from housing authorities or housing institutions. So that who is part of your coalition becomes critical when you also creating the task force, making sure there's representation, and definitely when you're creating this leadership steering committee for your coalition. Next slide. So this is, I put that slide there because this is going to be part of the new guidebook, and not a lot of people have seen this. And we have been going on a tour trying to understand, initially we're thinking about, like, as I shared earlier, like what defines digital inclusion coalition and how is it different? So we're thinking a set of measures, like, like being a data person, I love to think about, is that index, if you have all those three things, you are digital inclusion coalition. If you don't have those three things, you're not. And that's a very hard way to think about coalitions, because coalitions are living organisms, right? Because it's a collective and it's a community-based grassroots almost organization that it's really not, you either are a coalition, digital inclusion coalition, you're not. It's more, there's a development process, and coalitions are in different stages. So what you see here is what we learned about where coalitions are in their process of growth and development. So one, the first step, and we call it the first stage, is really, it's to start with the partnership. And what we found is that most coalitions that have formed, they started with a group, maybe two or three organizations that decided to partner to first work on a project. And the difference about project and work in a coalition, scope is that the right project has a beginning and an end date and has a very defined scope. We're going to work together to deliver this, and we're going to finish at this date. So creating the partnerships towards the digital inclusion area tend to be one of the ways that coalitions kind of launch. So once people work together on a grant, if the library is partnering with a housing authority and work on this grant and deliver and they come to the end, then we found that they decided to, hey, that was great, because again, we're providing different pieces of the puzzle, but I think there is more pieces of the puzzle to be put together, and we need more people to help the community. So that seems to be one of the areas how coalitions get started. And then, within the partnership, they decide that they're building a coalition for their community. It's going to be something that they really want to invest on. So from that to go to the next stage is really the process of building the coalition. And again, it's bringing people together, making sure you're being inclusive and what different organizations you want to be part of it. And then there are a couple activities that this stage seems to be consistent with coalitions around the countries that want to come together and build a mission and decide, what is our mission and how we are going to be advancing in the digital equity space and supporting our community. At this stage is when the group is starts to engage the community and raise awareness, and then really get more people to come and be part of it and being as inclusive as possible. Other activities include, identifying community resources. Who else is providing digital literacy in our community? Who else has a train-the-trainer resource that we can just all tap into and help build instead of duplicating? Who else? What are where people can go in our community to find affordable devices? And really, that's kind of like some of the questions and some of the areas that coalitions tend to play a role. And again, start to develop the framework, like how we're going to do work. So, and that leads to stage 3, which is starting to take action, like in support. At that stage, coalitions start looking for a more established and more almost formal support of anchor institutions and making sure that anchor institutions are part of the coalition. And that really goes into a little bit of the backbone and create the framework, right? So where do you do work and how work is get done is usually happen in this phase. And in the meetings and the opportunity for people engaged becomes a lot more consistent. And that seems to be a very important trend on creating coalitions and maintaining coalitions. And then some of the coalitions are now, at some point, you go to the refinement phase, which is strategic planning and thinking like, what's the environment? Did anything change? Do we need to rethink how we do things in our structure? It's really a time to refocus and to realize how the community has changed and shift, and does the coalition focus need to change and shift with it. So with that said, next slide. This part, guys, I promise it's very short. It's really want to share how some of the, thinking about the infrastructure bill and how the work of digital inclusion is really, it's about getting ready, especially at this stage. So it's great that you guys are here, and I see there's a lot of us here. But so next slide is, and that is because mainly one of the areas is about getting ready is that the infrastructure bill has passed, and we have the Digital Act in there, and then you see how the funding is allocated right now, and then within the infrastructure bill, there's some suggestions to the states to build the digital equity plan for the state. And what that becomes critical for coalition is that working with states it's clear that states are looking for a way to, if they build this plan, because they're only going to have 12 months to build a digital equity plan for the state, is to make sure that they have an organization that they can tap into, and they have the network within the local community that they can tap into to inform that plan. So if if the states choose to build the plan, then there is a set of money that they can tap to implement the plan. And as we NDIA start working with the broadband offices in the states, become very clear that they need coalitions, and they would like coalitions to be established and a way to connect to the resources and the needs in the community, especially if you go through like all the requirements for the digital equity plan that's in the infrastructure bill. So you see, next slide, and I think this is my last slide. If you're thinking about a coalition, and I think it's some topics that you should consider is that who can play and should play the role as a backbone organization. It's important, but I'll for a number of reasons. But one is that if your coalition is going to do some advocacy, and you with an organization that doesn't want to push back or doesn't want publicly say, say something that is going to sound like you're doing, going to jeopardize your 501c3 status. So it's just something to consider, that backbone organizations also needs to be anchor institutions. It usually helps, and also needs to be respected by the community. And if your coalition decides that they want to push back on some ISPs, you don't want to put the backbone organization in a tough position. A lot of coalitions now, there's a lot of funding for digital inclusion work, and people and organizations in fact are looking for a place. Again, the same way that the state broadband offices are looking for our organization and community groups that are already organized and it's focused on digital inclusion. There's a lot of funding opportunities for coalition, for service providers, and they are going to the coalitions to receive that funding, but making sure that your coalition has a good backbone organization as a fiscal agent in the beginning, and then that the coalition has the administrative skill to really hold the funding if that's something your coalition decide to do, and then report on that funding and so forth is important thing to consider. The direct service challenge, it's a big one, and some coalitions have different thoughts about it, but most of the coalitions we talk to, the direct service means like, is the coalition the one who provides digital literacy training? And most coalition says, no, we don't do direct service. We send them to the library. The library, as an organization, provide the direct service. The coalition provides the environment for those different organizations to come together to provide the service in a more aligned and comprehensive way. But the coalition itself is not the one connecting, building Wi-Fi networks or building, laying down fiber and refurbishing computers. Coalitions tend to be the ones who bring people to the table, and if there is a gap on service area, coalitions tend to put a task force to try to engage other organizations to serve that need. But most coalitions don't provide the direct service. One of the main reasons is that if coalitions do that, then they're in direct competition with their members. So if you have a nonprofit that's providing digital literacy or workforce development and building this, focusing on skill building, if the coalition itself as an organization decide to provide that service, they're going to start competing for funding, for participation, and then that might become a problem in your community. And then some of the coalitions are open for internet service provider to be part of the coalition. And that's something you need to consider. Do you want AT&T or T-Mobile or Google to have a seat at your coalition? And if they do you want them at the general membership, show up to the meeting once a month? Do you want them to be able to serve as task force members or working groups? Do you want them to be part of your leadership structure and help dictate, the conversations and guide the coalition moving forward? So there are different models. Most coalitions don't allow ISPs to be part of their steering committee, but it's something to consider. So with that, I'm looking forward to questions if you guys have any, but just know that we are scheduled to have, we guys gonna get a link to register for this, but we're gonna have just a smaller, like a more in-depth discussion. If you have any questions, if you wanna register for the technical assistance around coalitions on December 14th. So with that, I will stop sharing and see if you guys have any questions, any comments, and